My name is Peter Brooks, and I just want to say 2 minutes worth of introduction to this conference. The questions that we come together to discuss today very often grew out of the experience of prison teaching for me and for many of the others who are here. In my case, a course I taught at East Jersey State Prison in Rahway, New Jersey, a few years ago, which was for me an absolutely transformative experience. To experience as an outsider the reality of the inside of prison and the way it has affected so many lives in our country is to confront directly the way we as a society, as a country, have created the monster of mass incarceration. How has this shaped inner life, public spectacle, moral possibilities? What needs to be thought and said about incarceration? What do the literature and art of incarceration and of the incarcerated have to say to us? How does incarceration haunt even those outside of prison walls? What are the stakes of the prison education movement? These are all questions, or among the questions that we're going to think about here. Since I teach literature, I began to think about the place and image of prison in the public mind and in works of literature and art, going back at least to the Enlightenment, especially to the work of Cesare Beccaria, who published his On Crimes and Punishments in 1764, if you will, the very beginning of the prison reform movement, and of other poets, novelists, dramatists, artists, composers who have meditated on incarceration and the human mind. I think of Stendhal, Silvio Pellico, Alexandre Dumas, Dickens, Victor Hugo, Dostoevsky, Gramsci, and also Beethoven in his one opera, Fidelio. The French Revolution, you remember, kicks off with an attack on an infamous prison, the Bastille, which then symbolically is demolished stone by stone. I think prison has become the punitive shadow to all the major institutions of our society. We live in that shadow, but we also possibly believe in the promise, as one of my students at East Jersey put it, of turning prison into a university, a grand aspiration towards the transformation of the carceral space this country has created into a place of learning and creativity that brings us together today. At least that is the hope that brings us together today. So we're going to move at once to the first panel, but before I do that, I want to just speak a quick word of thanks to those who have brought this symposium into being. It was originally to have been at the Eric Holder Center at Columbia Law School 2.5 years ago. It was canceled because of COVID. It was planned along with my good friends Bernard Harcourt, who is here today, and Matthew Spellberg, who is in Alaska and couldn't be here today. Transferred to Yale, the symposium happily found new collaborators. Richard Weisberg and the Law and Humanities Foundation that he directs, Judith Resnick in the Arthur Lyman Center for Public Interest Law that she created at the Yale Law School, and Dwayne Betts and his Freedom Reads program, and the Whitney Humanities Center, where it found its present home, thanks to Alice Kaplan, the director, and Diane Brown, the assistant director, and their remarkable staff, including Megan O'Donnell and a number of others. So, thanks said, and that's really small thanks for the great work that they've done on this. I'm going to turn things over to Emily Bazelon, who's too well known to you all to need introduction. Among her many honors and attributes, fortunately for us, she's a lecturer and senior research fellow at the Yale Law School. Emily.
Thanks so much, Peter. It is such a pleasure to be here with all of you for this long-anticipated, exciting event, which has so much interdisciplinary richness to offer. I'm really excited to do a lot of listening and maybe just a little bit of talking this morning. I don't know. Is this working? They're all on. Okay, good. Thank you. That's okay. Thanks, Rachel. So I'm here with an amazing panel of people who bring just a real variety of perspectives to this topic of incarceration and imagination in a multi-genre way. Rachel Kushner, who is sitting to my right, is a novelist. Her novels are Telex from Cuba, The Flamethrowers, The Mars Room. I have read these books with great pleasure and partly agreed to participate in the stakes. I was so excited to meet Rachel. I really recommend them. And she has a book of essays called The Hard Crowd and is a contributor to The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, and a columnist for Harper's. Caleb Smith is a professor of English and American Studies at Yale, and his books that are especially relevant to today's discussion are The Prison and the American Imagination, and an edition of Austin Reed's Life of the Adventures of a Haunted Convict. And Joy James, who is further to my right, is the Ebenezer Fitch Professor of Humanities at Williams College and the editor of 4 anthologies about political prisoners and political activists. So I'm delighted to be here with this fabulous group. And as you can tell, we're spanning a number of genres here. This is a group that represents fiction, thinking about the prison as a space in which to create fiction. That is obviously like a choice that Rachel made in her third book, a choice about setting that I'm really eager to hear more about. And Caleb has written nonfiction and then thought a lot about first-person accounts and narratives from people who are incarcerated, which he will talk about more. And Joy has this perspective of people who are activists both within and outside of prison, and will be the respondent on the panel. So, Rachel, I was hoping that you would talk a little bit about what you think fiction is doing in this space of incarceration. Is it about witnessing? And if so, how does it differ? What can it offer that's different from nonfiction or kind of first-person accounts of life in prison, which are, of course, really important, and we have people in this room today who have those perspectives to offer. And I'm really interested in how you think the genre of fiction can complement some of the other writing and work and art we have in this area. So can I turn that over to you with that question?
Yeah. Should we share this? I don't know.
Sure, you can use it first.
All right. It's like a math problem. We have 4 people and 3 microphones. Each person gets a microphone for 1.33% of the time. Well, I wrote a little paper. Should I just read my paper or should I answer that question?
Well, you could read your paper and hopefully the answers will emerge at some point.
Yeah.
We have a while, so it's
I think that what I brought to present to you all here today very much speaks to exactly the points that you just brought up. So should I just go for it?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, it's 9:20. I think these are supposed to be like 10 to 12 minutes,
Yes.
correct? All right. When I was working on my novel, The Mars Room, I asked a friend who had spent 23 years in the prison on which I modeled my fictional one if women on death row there worked jobs. They work, she said. They have 6 sewing machines. What do they sew? I asked. Sandbags, she said, for the California Department of Transportation. Hearing this, an image flashed into my thoughts of an industrial axle turning and turning, as if I had suddenly been exposed to the boiler room of the world, or rather of California, which might as well be the world with its 40 million. After that conversation, every time I saw a sandbag on the side of the highway, I felt the turn of this axle, and I pictured women running synthetic fabric along the presser foot of a state-supplied sewing machine. These sandbags, which are everywhere when you start to look, remain for me a potent symbol that the penal system is floating all over the place. After I wrote The Mars Room, there was a question people sometimes asked that I did not like. Why didn't you write a nonfiction book about this? I responded mostly by asking, in turn, is not the novel a parallel universe where we can glimpse and understand aspects of this one? I think it's no accident that this symposium was conceived by someone who has given so much thought to the work of Balzac. That's Peter Brooks. Balzac's novels stand as a kind of zenith of what the 19th century novel can do, namely report on social reality in both its fine-grained detail and in its sweep and structures. Marx and Engels famously turned to Balzac for what his novels revealed about capital. Entire chapters of Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century rely on Balzac novels for their illumination of wealth distribution. As Peter Brooks notes, Balzac strove to rival the civil registry in his determination to people his world so thoroughly, from bankers to peasants to poets, to the figure, of course, of the criminal, male, whose cunning is to find shortcuts to wealth. Women might be tragic, but only men, like Balzac's infamous anti-hero Vautrin, can transgress. The shadow of the criminal in literature and also movies is long. It stretches from the 19th century into the mid-20th, with figures like Andy Griffith's character in A Face in the Crowd, discovered in the local jail, who rises to demonic heights as a Donald Trump-like peddler of serums. Cool Hand Luke's failure to communicate with a Florida prison warden, and Norman Mailer's version of Gary Gilmore in The Executioner's Song. By 1981, when imprisoned writer Jack Henry Abbott's letters to Norman Mailer were published as the book In the Belly of the Beast, this shadow was, I would argue, overtaken by a more engulfing set of shadows, the ones cast by institutions, the punitive turn, in the parlance of our symposium prompt. The reformatories and prisons that had shaped Jack Henry Abbott left such a mark on him that he was free only 6 weeks before he stabbed and killed someone. 6 weeks after that tragic turn of events, Michiko Kakutani, then the most powerful literary critic in America, condemned Norman Mailer in a New York Times article titled The Strange Case of the Writer and the Criminal. Kakutani summarized Jack Henry Abbott's long incarceration and short, brutal freedom. She blamed Norman Mailer for the stabbing of the victim, a young actor named Richard Aden. She talked about Mailer's obsession with violence and suggested that writers can only ever play with violence and that such play brings consequences. Kakutani's argument relies on the idea that the criminal is a social type, a member, if you will, of Balzac's registry. She's unaware and unwilling to grasp what prison, even already by 1981, had become in America, a way to manage social problems and inequality. Prisons draw, as we all know, from only one layer of society. Fate of origin, and not just destiny, do inform character, in life and in novels. But Kakutani suggests that Jack Henry Abbott's problem is that he isn't a reasonable man. That's the term she uses. Her article is fascinating to me because it is such a transparent attempt to exhaustively close a chapter of American literary history, one in which, as she sees it, writers believe there is a moral symbolism in crime and punishment. But it is Kakutani's argument itself that is, wouldn't it be funny if she was here today? But it is Kakutani's argument itself that is foreclosed and moribund. By 1981, the United States has embarked on a prison building project of breathtaking scope and reach. By then, literary meaning lies not in the figure of the so-called criminal, but in the institutions that shape this person. To say something true about a modern-day Vautrin, the novelist must perceive and understand the institutions that overshadow him. An interesting echo of Balzac's ambition to rival the civil registry can be found in Michel Foucault's hope to rival a registry of internment dating from the 18th century that he came upon in the Bibliothèque Nationale. Foucault planned to write a book inspired by the brief descriptions of imprisoned people in this registry. His book would be titled The Life of Infamous Men. He described the feeling he got upon reading brief and fragmented accounts of people whose stories suddenly rose up for him through 2.5 centuries of silence. What Foucault aimed to do was to restore the intensity of these obscure and unknown people's lives, as he put it, reduced to ashes in the curt tone of a public ledger book. Foucault describes them as cobblers, deserting soldiers, vagabond monks. All these people might have stayed in the dark, he says, were it not for the light of power that shone down on them, their moment in court, in prison, in this registry he holds in his hands. To write about a prison is perhaps not unlike writing about a school, the culture of a sea vessel, a hospital, or any other self-enclosed world. In this sense, I see a thread connecting Melville's Moby Dick to Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and John Cheever's Falconer. But much of what sustains a prison happens outside a prison. The penal system, as I said, is floating everywhere, seen or unseen depending. The writer may have been ensnared in it and recount from personal experience, as many have. I never was, but I grew up with people who were. Kids whose fathers happened to be police officers, while these kids all had a parole officer. Their mothers worked at bail bonds companies or as court clerks downtown. Now I live in Los Angeles, the nation's most populous county. My home is walking distance from our criminal court complex. A mile to the east is our jail complex. What I write as fiction cannot keep out what I see. I cannot help but notice who goes to court, to jail, and who works in these places. This is the world in which Balzac's Vautrin now finds himself. Los Angeles, manufacturing capital of the U.S. and a place of extreme wealth inequality, a city that spends half of its operating budget on police. Vautrin's job prospects might be a sorting warehouse in the Inland Empire or something higher paying and less legal. He might be the descendant of people who came west from Texas and Louisiana to work unskilled jobs in the aerospace industry, jobs that have long vanished. This new Vautrin is possibly acquainted with foster care, youth authority, and family court. He might try to find a shortcut to wealth or, more modestly, survival, but in a modern novel, he is not counseling Balzac's Rastignac on marrying rich ladies. He is boarding a sheriff's department bus, along with 60 other men, and heading for Corcoran Prison, deep in the heart of industrial farmland, where 6,000 others stand around on level 4 housing yards, overseen by guards for whom prisons are one of the biggest employers in their rural county. Corcoran is surrounded by irrigation canals through which subsidized water flows, water used to grow almonds that are exported all over the world, a crop that is largely automated and thus jobs in prisons rather than farming. In order to understand the life of this Vautrin, the author of the novel who casts him in a role will want to have some sense of cycles of drought and economic recession and state capacity. She'll want to know how hot it is on a level 4 yard at Salinas Valley or Chowchilla or Chino. She'll want to have glimpsed the circular logic of California prison industries, where they make pews for juries who decide the fate of people like them. About her Vautrin, the novelist will want to have a sense of the racial and class barriers he has faced, and of how and why her character might decide, catastrophically and probably quickly, that violence could be a solution to his problems. This is a modern Vautrin in modern California. He has come a long way from a Balzac novel, and he might even be a woman, which is how I wrote her, in my attempt to depict in my novel The Mars Room the life of someone put on a bus to prison in the Central Valley. I want to close by coming back to this question people have asked me. Why not write a nonfiction book about this stuff? The question isn't really a question. It's a suggestion that one should be doing activism, or at the very least, journalism, instead of writing novels, if you're going to bother people with such, quote-unquote, unpleasantness. Foucault's proposed project of converting the internment registry into narratives anticipated this very reaction. It is in the infamous of his title, Lives of Infamous Men, an adjective adding a promise of the lurid and the sensational, which I interpret as irony. The real-life outlaw, even now 300 years ago, was already buried under the shadow of the bureaucracies meant to limit and control him, to manage him, of the project to restore this man's intensity, as Foucault put it. Foucault himself said he lacked the necessary talent. He never wrote the book. I regard this phantom project he proposed as explicitly for us, the novelists, if not to complete, to at least begin.
Thank you. Caleb, you were going to talk about, I think, a different kind of writing from within prisons, conversion narratives. So I will turn things over to you.
Thank you, Emily, Rachel, Joy, everyone who did the work to organize this conference. When I saw the title for our panel, Literary History of the Incarcerated Mind, that singular really stood out to me, the mind. And since Peter mentioned some kind of inspiration for this conference coming out of his prison teaching, also one of my own experiences with prison teaching. Sure. Is that better? Can you hear me? So one of my own experiences with prison teaching has been kind of lingering in my consciousness as I prepared for this event, and it was a conversation I had with a student named Clyde when I was teaching in Cheshire Correctional Institute with the Wesleyan's prison program before we had our own here at Yale. And we were discussing Frederick Douglass's 1845 narrative in that class, and Clyde who was kind of a leader. Is Clyde here? He's here at Yale as a fellow now. That sort of interrupted the conversation, and he said, he'd been taking Wesleyan classes for years at this point, and he said, people like you come in here, they want us to read Douglass, and they want us to read Foucault, and they want to ask me about my subjectivity. He said, what I want to know is, what about your subjectivity? And that resistance to being seen as someone whose subjectivity was an object of curiosity and an object of interest on the people who were coming in, even presumably to be his teachers, is something that I have really tried to think about the sources of and dwell with a little bit. And I wanted to talk today about a specific genre that seems to me very central to the long literary history of imagining and attempting to understand or give accounts of incarcerated minds, and that is the conversion narrative, specifically the Protestant religious conversion narrative. And some of my research on the early decades and the cultural history of the U.S. prison system in the 18-teens, 20s, 30s, and 40s, I recently came across this very remarkable grave in Canandaigua, New York. It's a big monument with a tall obelisk above it and a weathered metal plate inscribed on it. And the text of the inscription reads this way. Jacob Hodges, an African Negro, born in poverty and ignorance, early tempted to sin by designing and wicked men, once condemned as a felon, converted by the grace of God in prison, lived many years a converted and useful Christian, died February 1842 in the faith of the gospel, about 80 years of age. This monument identifies the man by his name and by his race, and then it tells very briefly the story of his life. It goes back to his childhood in poverty and ignorance, passes through the crisis of his temptation and his sin. Hodges, as it turned out, was kind of conscripted by conspirators to participate in the murder of a white property holder in Orange County, New York. It recounts his religious experience in prison, and it confirms the lasting effects of that religious experience. When he was converted by the grace of God in prison, this grave marker says the change in his character wasn't just a fleeting kind of affectation. It really turned him around for good, and he lived many years this way in the faith of the gospel. So these are the kind of elements of a Protestant conversion narrative. First his ignorance, then his seduction, then his sin, then judgment and suffering, conversion, and this new, more faithful life that he lives out for the rest of his days. Above that Congregationalist or Anglo-Protestant conversion narrative, there's this Egyptian symbol, the obelisk. And I learned a little bit about this, trying to understand it, and learned that by about 1842, there were a number of obelisks in the North Atlantic metropoles, and it would be just 6 years later that construction began on the most famous one in the United States, the Washington Monument. So in 1842, in an upstate New York village cemetery, this is not exactly a shocking image, but it is a symbol of a kind of appropriation of an African form into this Anglo-American settler civilization. The place is called Pioneer Cemetery. So it seems plausible to me that this particular symbol was chosen partly because as a kind of testament to the successful racial assimilation of Jacob Hodges into this upstate community by way of his religious conversion, or at least to the hope of a kind of racial assimilation in a post-emancipation era in New York State. And then finally, there's the metal plate itself. Obelisks are ancient. Protestant conversion narratives go back at least to early New England settlements on this continent. But that metal plate is forged in a foundry, and it has forged bolts that are securing it into the base of this tomb. And so in that way, it's not only an ancient or even an old-fashioned Christian form, but also this tomb is very much an artifact of the new industrial economy that was taking shape in upstate New York, and one of whose major sites of development was the contract-operated workshops of Auburn State Prison, where Jacob Hodges was incarcerated for most of a decade. So I take this grave to be telling one person's story by way of the conversion narrative, but also as a kind of artifact of these three forces that came together at the foundational moment of modern industrial prison discipline. And those are evangelical religion, conflicts and struggles over the question of post-emancipation racial assimilation. This is a time of arguments about colonization versus education efforts to lift up the state's growing free black population, upstate New York. And also the industrial economy that was very quickly transforming the economy of upstate New York with what's historians sometimes call the market revolution and industrialization, which involved a rapid transition away from older systems, not only of slavery, but also of indenture and apprenticeship toward wage labor, so that the laboring population was suddenly much more mobile, and each worker much more on their own, and many instances of discipline that previously would have been handled domestically, that is by masters, are now being outsourced to the state, which is doing them in this doing labor discipline and moral discipline in the new institutions. You can see, I think, why a conversion narrative would be useful to a prison system that explained its project in terms of rehabilitation. it was aligned with the reformist program, not with vengeance and not even with mere incapacitation, but with the promise that people's characters could be rehabilitated in prisons. It was also aligned specifically with religious liberty. The chaplains who operated in Auburn State Prison were not paid by the state. They were paid by philanthropic organizations, and so your religious education in a place like Auburn could be seen as voluntary, not state-imposed. Right? And we have much evangelical activism to this day, which understands itself to be in favor of rehabilitation, but not in favor of rehabilitation under the direction of state-appointed elites. So those are the, and you can also see, I think, the kind of ideological work that prison conversion narratives would have done in the 19th century and perhaps still do today. They give a kind of moral legitimacy to large-scale captivity and compulsory discipline, and specifically tend to align incarceration not with re-enslavement, not with violence, but instead with a kind of moral correction. But over the past 200 years, as you can probably imagine, the conversion narrative as a kind of template for telling someone's life story or telling the story of someone's experience in prison, going through suffering, has also been adapted to many other uses. For criminal justice reformers, the ideal of rehabilitation, and in some cases the ideal of a kind of conversion or transformation of one's character, is often held up as the ideal against which other more abusive realities and injustices can be measured. So it can have this kind of critical function in relation to the way that criminal justice is actually being enforced. It also has been taken up in more militant and radical ways. You can think about autobiographies and even shorter pieces of autobiographical prison writing that talk about the author's conversion, not to a kind of the docility of a Christian conversion and acceptance of the justice of their own sentence, but instead to a kind of militant opposition to the systems that have seized them. Right? We can think about conversions to Marxism, conversions to radical Islam, conversions to faiths and positions that happen through the prison experience, but that set the author now against the system that has condemned them. For people like me who work in literary studies and cultural studies, these documents have a real richness. They are available to humanist kinds of reading and criticism. We may have a sense in reading them that we've been able to recover or at least acknowledge voices against the silencing power of the state. We might encounter real narratives of psychological and spiritual vividness in these personal accounts. The kind of irony of the traditional conversion narrative is that it was supposed to be your own intensely sincere experience, but it wasn't a real conversion narrative unless it conformed perfectly to the template of the conversion narrative, right? But people have, of course, developed stories about conversion that have a lot of idiosyncrasy and richness and intensity and singularity. We can read these texts for moments in which they seem to resist or subvert or even just improvise against what seems to be the script that's been provided for them to perform, and so locate moments of agency, locate moments of subversion, and so on. It is a genre that has a long history then and many uses and much richness. At the same time, it has its limits, or certain ways of approaching it can be limiting. And specifically, one reason I'm glad to be thinking here with Rachel's account of what novels can do is that much of what she's just described in terms of the sweep of a social world is what falls away in a conversion narrative. Right? The incarcerated mind. Right? The conversion narrative itself, maybe part of its ideological function is to say, hey, the prison isn't so bad. It actually gave me this opportunity to correct myself and rehabilitate myself and so on. But another part of its ideological function is to say, here is one story. Right? One person's story, and that's what prison is. It's one person's story. Right? And so the large sweep and scale of the catastrophe may drop out of view if we think about the singularity of this voice. How then do we scale up from this one story to the mass, to the system, to the structure? I think this is a problem in how we think about conversion narratives, and in some ways I think it's a problem at the heart of how much the humanities themselves can say or do in relation to these systems. But what I've tried to at least sketch out here, at least at the beginning, is ways of reading these not only in order to acknowledge and value the particular stories that they tell, but also to move out from them into the scales and structures of historical forces that give them weight and give them meaning. And the three in particular that seem resonant to me, that seem almost to have come out of frozenness and reanimated themselves in our own time, are the three that I mentioned shaping the tomb of Jacob Hodges at the beginning. We have a very active white evangelical movement aligned with the politics of harsh punishment in our country right now, just as they did in the burned over district of upstate New York during the Great Awakening of the 1840s. We have a radical shift and destabilization of our economic system. For them, it was the transition from indenture, apprenticeship, and slavery toward industrialism and wage labor. For us, it is the other side of deindustrialization that's been analyzed by Ruthie Wilson Gilmore and many others as being the economic context within which this system takes shape. And we have a kind of moral panic about racialized migrant laboring populations, just as they did in upstate New York in the 1840s, and conflicts over whether there will be a kind of assimilation overseen by white Christian nationalist authorities, or whether there can only be exclusion, separation, and expulsion. And reading for those political forces is one way I think we can both see the singularity of the conversion narrative and of the voice in it, and also think about some of the larger political and cultural forces that give it its force and give it its meaning, and toward which we have to gain some leverage. Thanks.
Thank you. Can I hand it over to you?
Yeah, sure.
Great.
Okay, good morning. Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Rachel and Caleb. It's really rich. So I've got 5 minutes. I'm going to have to squash. There's a lot in both of your, contributions. And I started thinking, excuse me, I started thinking of dichotomies. And the possibility of what could be synthesized, right? So you have fiction, you have nonfiction, you have this subject gazing at the object, meaning the incarcerated. I also wanted to add the possibility that there's the focus on the individual, but there's also the collective and the communal, right? That whole communities can be decimated and they're reconstituted, that fathers will meet their sons incarcerated, mothers who have long terms can meet their children, or we spoke about it last night, give birth inside of these systems and then have their child removed and disappeared, right? So I'm wondering how you see the convergence, right, as a conversion narrative, right? So, Caleb, you laid out what we've inherited and what we will leave our children. Hopefully it will improve, but the odds don't seem so great at the moment. So Kathy Bulow, who's at University of Chicago, has a text on how the white supremacists underground came above ground, and these long wars that the U.S. had in the Middle East actually professionalized them as an army, right? And so it's not just what happens in the voting space, it's also what happens with people who I think you were pointing to when you're talking about this increasing animus against migration, right? From sites that have been devastated by the overconsumption, right, of water and environment devastation, right, done largely by the West. So if there is a convergence, what might that look like as a political phenomena? And also, what are the possibilities that as much as we emphasize morality, we need a shared understanding of political ethics, right? So how we want to be as moral people is that we care about the incarcerated, which is, and I really heard you when you said, well, people are saying, well, why don't you do nonfiction and be useful, right? Which, of course, is a false dichotomy, because your work is abolitionist work. And people who are incarcerated, at least a few times I've been able to be inside, they are also writers and authors. And they read novels, and they write novels, they write poetry, they write memoirs. But I'm wondering, as academics and people in this room are also writers, to what extent do we have a community of writers, whatever genre we explore or, dabble in or become professionalized in or brilliant in, that it actually constitutes a political ethics that can bring another kind of conversion narrative other than the evangelical reactionaries that are on the rise. And I'm not sure, that we've agreed to even attempt that endeavor. These are all peers. The incarcerated writers are our peers, right, and our teachers. And I wonder what would it take, to push forward with that. And I just want to give a couple specifics, because I know I have 2 minutes left. So I was thinking of, you brought up Foucault, and Foucault visited Attica. And Foucault also, under the encouragement of Jean Genet, wrote a pamphlet that Guillemard published. It was in French to a decade or so ago. I think it was called The Assassination of the Mass Assassination. And he was talking about George Jackson's death. So this would be someone who needed a conversion, but it wasn't going to be into a certain kind of religiosity. It was going to be a conversion to a certain kind of militancy aligned with the Black Panther Party. And I would argue that the state and society doesn't want those kind of conversions. So if I've got 60 seconds now. So, but I'm really troubled by the ethics of this. What we don't want is what will continue to manifest because of the violence arrayed against certain communities. So do we have a tolerance of interacting with what we don't want, right? To stitch together a sort of common political ethics. So Jean Genet wrote the foreword to George Jackson's book at the encouragement of Faye Stender, who is an attorney, kind of recruited him, as white intellectuals who were I want you to do, my legal degrees from University of Chicago, you're Jean Genet, I want you to do this for this book that's very rebellious. And he agreed to do that, right? James Baldwin will write an open letter for Angela Davis when she's on trial. And before increasingly the populations can say, we can embrace her, we understand that she has a certain kind of innocence and legitimacy. But there are people who are rebels, and there are people who are not innocent. And they continue as our peers. So if we were to recognize that, what would we become? And then how does that, subject-object, dichotomy become a synthesis, and the fiction, nonfiction kind of merge into just literary contributions that would allow us to have more strategies and more tools for what we need to do?
I love that. Thank you. I'm going to add a little bit to this discussion because it's hitting so many notes from my own work, so I can't quite resist. Caleb, you were talking about the American mind, and I think the incarcerated mind could also be the American mind. And I always pluralize words like that because to me as a journalist, one of the most difficult aspects of my work is figuring out how to use a story, a narrative to say something about this scaled up catastrophe. And, Joy, you're taking this in another direction, not just multiplicity, but thinking of people as peers, as opposed to necessarily the subject-object relationship. And when you're a writer who's not yourself incarcerated and you're writing about other people, there is this kind of way in which they are, if not the object in a, abstract way, you're trying to understand their world. You're not within it. And I think the reason to me that's so obvious for art or novels or fiction or movies about incarcerated people and environments and the communities they're parts of is that hopefully those are things that move people or outside this self-enclosed world that you were talking about, Rachel. And so there's a parallel universe that pulls in more people's hearts and minds. But the step to thinking about people as peers is a more radical and profound step that I think, as a society, we continue to fail at almost all the time. I've been thinking about it personally because I wrote a story for the New York Times Magazine a couple years ago, or actually a year and a half ago, about a man named Udico Briley who wrote to me from prison. And he wrote a short but very clear letter. I get a lot of mail from incarcerated people. Lots of lawyers and journalists and even professors do. And it's hard to know what to make of this multiplicity of voices. It can feel sort of overwhelming. But this letter touched me for a couple of reasons. There was a claim of innocence that Udico made in it, but he also said that he was in prison for 60 years for an armed robbery, and nobody had been injured in that armed robbery. And so my initial response was to think, well, that was so drastically unfair, such an example of excessive punishment, which is something Dwayne Betts, who unfortunately isn't here with us today, but something he talks and thinks and has taught me a lot about. So I reached out to Udico. We started corresponding through JPay, the sort of corrupt for-profit service that is what a lot of incarcerated people are forced to rely on. And Udico was sort of having to reel me in, right, and interest me. There was this way in which he had to figure out a way to persuade me to care about him. And then over the course of time, I got more involved in this case. I ended up looking for a lawyer for him because it was so clear to me that what he needed was a lawyer, not a journalist at this moment. That lawyer happened to be my sister. So then this trying to figure out, whether there was a way to exonerate Udico years after he'd been incarcerated became this kind of joint project. And Udico is a very charismatic person. So his sort of personhood was really important to what we were working on. And he was really, in a lot of ways, he was driving what was happening, but also, of course, had kind of limited agency necessarily. So in the end, he was not guilty of this crime he'd been convicted of, and he was exonerated in part because the community in New Orleans changed. The voters decided to elect a new district attorney and a new judge who were much more interested in actual justice than the people who'd preceded them. And so Udico got out of prison, was exonerated. It's now about a year and a half later. And I started getting more mail after my piece came out, not surprisingly, and I couldn't bear to just not respond to the letters in the way that I had tended to do in the past. So I started a project here at Yale in which law students and I have been working with these letters to create a database that's on the Freedom Reads website and is trying to amplify the voices of incarcerated people. And it's very much about a kind of multiplicity of voices and hoping that this is something Dwayne says a lot, that if people could see and hear the voices that we see and hear, if you're in touch with people on the inside, that maybe that would create the kind of energy for change and radical reform that we are still lacking. It's not quite a peer relationship, though. And yet I have ended up having exactly that relationship with someone who's incarcerated, whose name is John J. Lennon, who's a prison journalist who Dwayne introduced me to. And John and I have been writing together a newsletter for the New York Times about some of these stories that are coming in. And it's really turned into a collaboration. I don't think I really thought it through very much when Dwayne proposed it. I was sort of glad to feel like maybe I was supporting John in some way. But that is not the way the relationship is developed. John turns out to have lots of ideas to offer, but also incredible patience. So we had this period over the summer where my editors were not really sure what shape they wanted the first edition of this newsletter to take, and I was getting really impatient with them and frustrated. And John was the one who really kind of saw through my frustration and was able to say, you know what, like they are trying to make this as good as it can be, and we need to take their feedback and really incorporate it and think about, you know, why they're having us change course. And he was by far the more mature one in this interaction of the two of us, which shouldn't have really surprised me. And yet it really turned the tables on my own assumptions about who peers can be and what those kinds of relationships can be. So I guess I'm telling the story because it seems to me that what we're hearing up here is this sort of grappling with what it is to tell stories, to figure out a way how to scale them up to recognition of the catastrophe you were talking about, Caleb. But then also figuring out this move where we're not just sort of bestowing attention. We're also really seeing people as individual humans and as just like us, just in a different self-enclosed world. So that was a lot of thinking. But I wonder, Rachel, if that speaks to some of your work.
Well, yeah, I'm still thinking about what Joy was saying, like so many incredibly incisive points she made that I immediately wanted to respond to and then incorporate what you just said, Emily. But so back to Jean Genet, just for a quick second. I'm so glad you mentioned him because actually in that incredibly damning article, self-damning maybe, piece that Kakutani wrote in 1981, she quotes Joyce Carol Oates, who says that actually Jack Henry Abbott was not a real criminal or an authentic criminal, and she uses the word authentic because he seemed like somebody who'd read a lot of Jean Genet. And so she's desperate to keep writers over here and criminals over here, and anybody who smells like literature cannot come from the streets. And it's just it's wonderfully transparent or horribly transparent. In my own experiences working with people inside prison, which I do, separate from writing novels, I have peers who are serving life sentences. In one case, somebody who's serving 2 life sentences, meaning when she goes up for parole after her 25 years, if the parole board deems her suitable for freedom, then she can start her second sentence. And a lot of these people are readers. I have one friend in prison who told me that the most popular book on administrative segregation, which is Chowchilla's version of Solitary, the most popular book is Malice by Danielle Steele. And I said, that's a novel about women in prison. She goes, yeah. And I've quite ignorantly, this was several years ago, said, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I think it's useful. I said, why would you want to read, you guys are stuck in prison. Why would you want to read a novel about prison? And she goes, Rach, we don't just want to read novels about your all's divorce or whatever. She's like, we want to read books about people like us. And what she was doing was challenging me, but also supporting me because I wanted to write this novel, The Mars Room. And she was like, you do that. You write that novel. I also, I work with people in prison together on projects. I used to be involved with this organization, Justice Now, whose board of directors was comprised entirely of people inside prison, mostly serving very long sentences. And the reason that was the case was because the woman who started that organization, who actually got the Faye Stender Award one year, said to a friend of hers inside prison, bring me like shot callers, bring me the most influential people in the whole prison. And those are people who are serving very long sentences. And then they were trained in human rights work to like each one teach one and teach the signs of human rights abuses to other people in prison. Working with those people, I am much more a student than I am a teacher. And I don't fool myself that this is an equitable world. I'm acutely aware of these power differentials. They can call me collect. I can simply not answer the phone. I cannot call them, etc. I think that this work is uneven and ongoing, to answer that. In terms of, maybe I misunderstand, but you brought up morality, and I thought this is such an interesting word to use in a world where the religion and ideology of liberalism is that liberalism as a kind of universalism is going to hold up any person who wants it and then can access the kind of freedom that liberalism affords us, like consumer freedom. This is not the case. So then what do we do with, if I understand it, individual morality as opposed to a collective ethics? The last thing I just want to say quickly is, listening to Caleb's talk, I was reminded of what seems to me a really terrible irony, at least in California, which is that maybe the only vestiges left of the idea of a fundamentalist conversion narrative in the prisons that are managed by the California Department of Corrections is that the Bible is the one thing you can have no matter what you've done in prison. When you find yourself in the jail of the prison, or the jail of the prison, which would be to go to solitary and leave your prison, that ADSEG, and go to an ADSEG prison, they will never take away your Bible. And it's almost as if they are saying, and I only realized this listening to him talk, that those inside prison who have messed up are condemned to religion in a way that the rest of us are not. We can continue to shop and lease cars and do this and that, but they have to pray.
What you're describing is the ongoing, it's exactly continuous with evangelical prison reform in the 1820s, whose project was to mass print Bibles and put one in every single cell. When Jacob Hodges was released, one of the reformers went and asked him if he could have the prison Bible that had converted, that Hodges had had his conversion with. And Hodges was like, "No, you can't have it. Why would you presume that you can take this away from this one thing?" And after he died, Hodges sent it to the Reform Society, and this minister Lewis Dwight used to go around holding up Hodges' Bible as a kind of prop in his sermons. It's an interesting thing because evangelicalism, it was like a first mass media religious movement, just as it has become like a televangelism and internet phenomenon now. But suddenly the mass printing gave regressed back to this fetish of the single object that had converted Hodges. Yeah, the aura came back. Yeah. I wanted to say a little bit about Joy's great question about what forms of community are kind of broken apart and reconstituted. As sometimes when we describe criminalization and incarceration as a tactic of class war and race war, the response to that is, oh, but a lot of poor people support harsh punishment, or a lot of people in the black community want police to keep them safe or something. And the point is not people with privilege and property support harsh punishment and everyone else doesn't. It's that criminalization and incarceration and policing as the only point of interface with any kind of state service divides, right? Creates this division. And in New York State already in the 1840s, the stone-cutting masons at large were saying, we can't compete with this incarcerated labor that's no-wage labor, and it's creating a class division within this emergent working class in the era of wage labor, and that is ongoing. But it's also true that we see, I think your point about some conversions are isolating and some are conversions into a different solidarity or into a different community is really a meaningful one that I didn't draw out much in my presentation. Often those of us who teach learn from our students that they've been going off to the block and conducting seminars on the same topics. Not that they're transmitting what I said about the text, but that they're having their own discussion about the text. And some of that is coming back to change our conversation in the room. The kinds of small scale connections and community that get formed on those long bus rides, out to the Central Valley or something, and then become networks of activism that can link out and so on. I think, I really like the distinction between a kind of moralism and an ethics. For my part, I do become a little wary when I hear a language of, we need a reckoning on this topic. As if as if the spirit is going to sweep across the land and people are going to embrace a new faith on justice. To me, that kind of talk expresses in part a sense of dispossession and no access to the real mechanisms of how you change a political structure. And so the idea of an ethic that's more about, well, people might actually have many reasons for being against this or for being in solidarity with each other, and that there would be a kind of lateral ethic of mutual respect of what brings people to the work around a common project is the way that I would understand that difference between a kind of, an awakening and a kind of solidarity ethic. This Well, I think that's I want to give other people some time to talk. So
Yeah. So this is a half joke for Rachel as a former seminarian, as praying works. But also, I think it's interesting. We've talked a lot about Christianity. So a number of people that I know who, so my work, right, is political theory, and I work with radical, theorists. But people who were in the Panthers are now Muslims. So their names are changed. Duruba bin Wahad, Jalil Muntakim, Asad Shakur, right? So there is something about spirituality and religion, and maybe because it is Islam, that it's also a counter to, a reactionary Christian state or certain kind of dictate, like you're saying, the Bible is sacred. You could, that's your key. You could carry it anywhere. Quran, maybe no. If you're a Buddhist, maybe you have a little gray area. I'm wondering, to go back to something I asked before, and I also want to put on the table, there's a prison strike right now in Alabama, right? And so we talk a lot about censorship around critical race theory, like the banned books thing that appears to be mushrooming, from the South and then moving across the U.S. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how incarcerated writers are censored and how it's difficult for them to get their works out, particularly if they're critical of the state itself. Because we know that the state has predatory strategies and a history. The 13th Amendment legalizes enslavement, right, in prisons, or if you've been duly convicted of a crime. So that's kind of on the table. And then the last thing, and then I'll stop, is the dichotomy between the privileged imprisoned or prisoner and then the one that is expendable. So when Davis was on trial, she had a co-defendant, Rochelle McGee, and there was an online celebration of his 82nd birthday. He's still inside, right? Because he actually was in Marin County and he was holding one of her guns, right? But his argument is that he was a slave and all slaves have the right to fugitivity. Davis's position was that she is not a slave. She's a citizen. And so she has the right to the protection of law. There are segments of the incarcerated who see themselves as captives through the filter of the 13th Amendment. And so their writings will be less likely to appear in public. And so the public's ability to protect them, if, like Stevie Wilson, who's a Black queer writer, he's continuously thrown in the hole because he's talking about abuses by guards, abuses by systems, right? So I'm wondering about, the protective mechanism that the author can offer to the incarcerated.
Can I?
Yeah.
Man, I mean, I wish, we don't have that much time in there. You just raised many important points, but just a couple things that come to mind. Sorry to sound acerbic, but the Marshall Project is an organization that was started by Bill Keller, who used to be was the editor of the New York Times, and it's meant to be a project about incarceration in America. And when it was first started, they had a kind of like fundraising cocktail party in Los Angeles, and somebody invited me, even though I was not the target audience of the party, which was about raising money. And I asked, "Are you going to have a section where you share the writing of incarcerated people?" And Bill Keller said, "Well, this is not going to be Prison Poetry Monthly." And people went, and I, wanted to gun down the entire crowd. But so then the Marshall Project started, and I did turn to it as a resource for friends inside prison who wanted an outlet for their writing because of what they were doing. And they had a really, big platform and a lot of money behind it. And one friend of mine's work was published in the Marshall Project twice, and I had to be her interlocutor with them because they didn't have a JPay thing set up at the time. And so she would send the pieces to me and I would send them to them. And I noticed that she was always calling the editor Mr. And I would have these conversations with her. Don't call him Mr. He's merely your editor. He's not a guard. He is not your counselor in prison. But it was just so hard for her to get beyond these kinds of institutional hierarchized sorts of exchanges. Anyone free is like a Mr. or a Mrs. So when her first piece was published for the biography, the editor asked me, "Can you supply a bio?" No, he didn't ask me, "Can you supply a biography?" He didn't say anything about the bio. And I said, do you need a bio for this writer? And he said, "Oh, for the incarcerated writers, we include their age, the prison where they're incarcerated, and the crime of which they were convicted." And I honestly saw a man opening a woman's mouth to count her teeth. And so I just totally freaked out and said, "You can't, but then I'm in this position. Do I want to stop my friend from being published in this magazine, or do I have to assent to their rules?" And I got into a big fight with the Marshall Project that is ongoing to this day. But for that one thing, he said, "I just won't include a bio." So she didn't get to be treated with the normal courtesy with which a writer was treated. And at first I tried to use kind of obfuscation and say, "Oh, women don't like to have their age mentioned in their bio. That's not the normal kind of thing you would put." I mean, it was like birth date, location, and crime. So there are these outlets that were given as resources to help our friends inside prison, but we have to push back against these idea that they would be otherized at every step of the way. I don't know if that speaks to some of what you were saying, but that's what came to mind.
I just have a short update because I was talking with John Lennon about this very issue recently. He has been a contributor to the Marshall Project, and your advocacy, I think, had some effect, Rachel, although I think he and other people have continued it. So he wound up as an advisor to what is, I think, and I don't work at the Marshall Project, so if other people have other information, maybe we can add that during the questions, but he became an advisor to what I think has become a sort of regular contributor feature part of the publication, which is voices from people who are incarcerated and submissions and essays they've written. And he was saying that his battle was to get those names onto the masthead so that there would be this kind of, real recognition of the contributions they were making. Anyway, I just had to add that little update.
Please.
It's really interesting, and reducing people to especially deciding that the crime of their conviction has to be the kind of tagline when that's not something they're choosing is kind of amazing, and I guess also not. Caleb?
Yeah, well, I wanted to give at least a mention to Joy's volume, The New Abolitionists, which has this work that she's describing, and encourage people to read the writers that are in that. I also want to tell a little bit about my experience in discussing the 1858 prison memoir, The Life and the Adventures of a Haunted Convict, which Joy wrote an incredible essay about for Boston Review. That's kind of how we first got to be in touch. But Reed wrote a retrospective memoir of his life in the 1850s, and as I traveled around with that and describing his life and the conditions, he was also at Auburn State Prison that I've just been describing, which was the birthplace of the sort of penal servitude that did eventually get enshrined in the 13th Amendment. That is, it was Northern industrial penal servitude that was, for which an exception was made, that then came to be exploited by the Southern states in that re-enslavement project, because Auburn could not have operated without this unwaged labor in its workshops. Anyway, the people, as I discussed Reed and his life story, this goes back also to the question of genre or fiction, nonfiction kinds of narrative. The crowds were very deeply preset with two expectations. One, that his book was a diary or journal rather than a retrospectively crafted narrative of his life. So they wanted the kind of access to the raw experience, unmanipulated by art somehow. And two, that he was innocent. Neither of which was the case. He fully he described his participation in crimes and never. I mean, he had a kind of protest against the entire system, but on the specific grounds of his own, of the accusation and sentencing, there wasn't a disagreement. And so that does seem to me to speak to what you're saying about what kinds of stories people expect and are ready to endorse, and this question of innocence that you raised before, and what kinds they don't want to hear or they don't want to think of as being, on their side or politically aligned with. I think that it also, and so there are truths that people don't want told in this writing. But the thing about the wanting it to be a diary also suggests another kind of pressure that's alongside that in some awkward ways, which is that incarcerated writers are only supposed to talk about their own experience as such. And so there's a kind of like, we're not coming to them for their poetry or whatever, right? There's the, this isn't, I don't want your artistry, I want the kind of autoethnographic truth of this. And Reed has an amazing moment in his book where he talks about being asked by a group of kind of anti-slavery, wealthy white liberals to recite some abolitionist poetry for them, which he does, and they're moved to tears. He recites a poem by the British anti-slavery poet William Cooper. They give him money, they offer to support his education. And then a kind of aside to the reader, he says, I wonder what they would have said if I recited some outlaw ballads instead. Right? He's very sophisticated about what kind of sympathy is available to him, what kind of charity case he's being asked to play in that situation, and what the kind of like white racial liberalism of that economy is, and that he carves out for himself another kind, to think of himself as someone who could deploy many genres, as an artist who's capable of many kinds of storytelling, and who could confront them with something that wouldn't be so readily acceptable. And I as a scholar of 19th century, I'm routing a lot of my answers back through this historical stuff, but I do think that there is some continuity there. I would say there's this double bind of tell us the truth, but not too much, right?
And I think, Joy, that speaks to the question you were asking about prisoners who are writing a more 13th Amendment-based challenge to their incarceration. And I wonder if that, for you, brings up any other questions about just like the limits of this kind of communication. I mean, are we obviously the people who are in charge of the prison environment have an enormous amount of control over what comes out unless people are able to smuggle images and writings out. And if you want to put your name on something that you're writing, then the smuggling avenue is you can do it, but then you're going to be punished for it, right? And so we're there. So I guess I wondering about two things. So there is this real cost that someone like, sorry, I've forgotten the name of the person you were referencing before who was not able to get his writings out or who's being put in.
Stevie Wilson.
Stevie Wilson.
He had some of his work is out, but he's continuously harassed.
Yes. So he's having this particular dilemma of wanting to be the named author in the work he's producing because it's his creative mind that's producing it. It's his work. It should have that recognition, but there's this incredibly clear cost to bear. So that's one sort of very contemporary manifestation, I think, of the limitations that Caleb was talking about. And then we're having this moment where prisons are losing control over some of the particularly photographs and even videos that are coming out of these environments because of the, cell phone culture in which people are able to document their worlds. And in the last several months, the New York Times, other publications have run these incredibly disturbing set of photos and images that, people within the walls took to document and show what they were happening. And the reason those images can come out with maybe a little more safety for the people producing them is that they're anonymous. And so their power you don't get to claim the ownership and authorship of it. Anyway, I just was thinking about those things as you were talking.
Yeah. So two quick things. Like the reason why Caleb I got into anthologizing, I said it elsewhere, is that I was asked by Davis to do a prototype for critical resistance, and I did at CU Boulder, Colorado, and then anthologized, the academics and the intellectuals who were there. And I agreed with the press, or asked the press, to send 50 copies inside. And so I was given a list of incarcerated people, including people who had been in the Panther Party. And so one person who'd been in the party wrote back, again, I say, it's kind of a joke on me. I thought I was being helpful, that the book he didn't say it wasn't that good. He just said, thank you. But, it doesn't really reflect the conditions inside of long-term detainees, particularly those who came in as political, because they have surplus torture. Because the point is, we don't just want to break you, we want to break your connection to these ideas that make you think you could take on the state, right? And so when I went to Brown from there, all I did was anthologize, right? But also, people weren't ready for it, so I left eventually. But when I was writing, it could be the Berrigans, who were, pacifists. Daniel, I can't remember. One of them had cancer and died inside, so I think it was Philip or Daniel. I'm sorry, I keep mixing up the brothers. They're Catholics who were against the war in Vietnam. They were Catholic priests, and then one of them left the church, right? He was a contributor, right? But then you get letters back. So the consequences, you get the letters back from the prison officials that you're trending towards illegal behavior by trying to get information from the incarcerated about their perspective in politics. You get pushback from the university itself because they're not ready for conferences where former, Weather Underground, Laura Whitehorn or something, come to campus and speak. That was prohibited 20 years ago. Now it's okay. So then one of the things that comes into my mind, maybe I should take more naps and not think this much, but it seems like what you couldn't do 20 years ago with rebels, you can do now. I have former students, when I was at Brown, I was teaching courses on the Panthers who are, they're writers now. They're doing a book, or other people are doing books on George Jackson. I could barely teach George Jackson at Brown. My students went on a verbal strike. They sat in the class for 2 hours and didn't say anything because I assigned George Jackson's Soledad brother and Frank Wilderson in the beginning of his writings on Afro-pessimism, right? And it was, they were clever, they were brilliant, they were ethically committed. But it was, I think this is what you were saying, there's certain truths that nobody wants to hear. It's not even that they're inconvenient, they're incompatible with who we are. But now there's more compatibility. And so I'm wondering if they're turning to commodities. If past rebels are now the commodities of the 21st century. And if we're going down that road, then what is rebellion against a proto-fascist state? Which the prison already is. You're just waiting for prison culture, which is already, it's a parallel mirror, distorted one, of increasingly what happens at the borders, when you shoot people coming over, because they're trying to flee, devastation. And increasingly what's happening in different sectors of society, Buffalo, Uvalde. So, these are way too big questions. They're giving me a headache, but they're constant, and I don't live the conditions. There are people who live the conditions of severe violence who are thinking all the time. And then I think about it as an ally, but I'm not sure how steady my bridge is over. And I have no intention of being implicated in anything so that I lose my privilege or my standing. So those are some of, that's what I meant about the ethics. I'll say I'm a good person, so I have personal morality. What my political ethics are, they continue to shift. One last thing is Kevin Johnson is supposed to be executed in Missouri next month on November 29th. And so people have asked us to help, but, one, I don't think, it's Missouri. I don't think you can stop this. But then what could be said about his writings so that we remember him if we can't keep him alive? And I think that's just the basic bare minimum that people make. Those are their basic requests.
We have a few more minutes. I wonder if there's anyone in the audience with a question they are interested in asking. I know it's always hard to be the first person who asks a question, but it looks like I have some takers. Peter, I feel like your hand is up. You get the first question.
I was very struck by all sorts of things, but by Rachel's phrase about being condemned to religion. When the Bible... I was struck by Rachel's phrase of being condemned to religion. The only book you can take into solitary is the Bible, essentially, and which aligns with the conversion narrative that Caleb was talking about. I was thinking back to an ancient genre, I think starts in the 17th century, of the Newgate biography, where the ordinary of Newgate, who was the chaplain of the big prison in London, took confessions and autobiographies from convicts who were about to be hung. And he would literally stand at the foot of the gallows and take their confessions, and then he'd write them up and publish them and sell them for sixpence. And he made a handsome supplement to his salary by doing this. So this is the moment of truth, right, in which they have to express Christian thoughts, but it gives them a kind of posthumous glory in infamy, because they're supposed to detail all their crimes, but then tell how their crimes led to their moment of repentance at the foot of the gallows and so on. So there's some unhealthy connection here, it seems to me, between conversion, infamy, and publicity and profit, of course, because he's making a good profit of this. And you talked about Vautrin, Balzac's great criminal, and there's this wonderful moment when he converts to the police, and what he essentially says is there's no difference between cops and Rogers. They're just two faces of the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Listening to you talk, Peter, I was thinking also about Joy's referencing of the death penalty. So, like in this version where you're allowed to confess or forced to confess right before you go, I fortunately can't remember the name of the person, but somebody was executed just a couple weeks ago, and the last line of the article was, he said nothing when offered a final comment. Before I can't remember if he died by electrocution or by injection, one of those two methods. Okay, thank you very much, Joe Nathan James. There was another execution last summer, I believe. Unfortunately, also, like, I'm nervous. I don't remember the name of that person either. But what the odd thing that I remember about this other execution is that the journalist who was sent to report on it was told by the guards that her skirt was not long enough and that it needed to be exactly at the knee and not 1 inch above it. I believe it was half an inch above her knee. And so one of the lawyers who was going to be at that execution loaned her from the trunk of his cars a pair of fishing hip waders, which she was allowed to wear into this execution. The reason I bring this up is that it just speaks to the absurdity of the bureaucratic apparatus that attends to matters of life and death involving people. I think about that a lot, how strange that is. I guess finally, maybe I just want to add that these confessions, were sold, according to Peter, is interesting to me because it also maybe reminds me of a point that maybe I keep coming back to here this morning about some desperate need on the part of a free citizenry or those who manage a free citizenry to keep separate those who need to confess from those who might possess a confession, almost as a talismanic reminder that they themselves will not be entangled in that process.
He has this beautiful passage in this in Remarks on Marx from 78 where he says, well, of course, all of my work has always been fiction, right? How could you not do fiction? My historical work was fiction. Of course, historical facts, you can check them all. You can do the kind of fact checking for that work and for social scientific work, but threading it together, sewing it together, right? And what you do with it is always an act of fiction. And in part, we aren't willing, that's true. Our non-fiction is fiction. Our social sciences are fiction. But we're not willing, in part, to accept that because, as academics, we need to protect ourselves from that cut. But in truth, it's true of journalism as well. Everything is fiction. And what that means is that everything is a political engagement.
Yes. Why don't you have the last word? Because I want to be respectful of the time. I'll close things off. No, sorry. I didn't mean to intimidate you. Go.
Well, I love what you've said, but I also fear that maybe like fiction is a kind of dirty word there because it suggests a straying from truth, although that's you probably meant something much more nuanced than that. But I would say, like, fiction to me, in a way, is actually sort of, back to your question, is separate from or safe from or protected from, in a sense, the political. Because the writer herself, when she embarks on the project of reflecting the world through the grand and hallucinatory mythical envelope that we call the novel and started, 200 years ago, when she embarks on that project, she does not already have an idea or an argument of what the problem is, nor what the solution is, and rather wants to reflect reality in its granular detail to the best of her ability. So in that sense, if she has somebody who's in prison, if they're in prison in California, probably they actually did the thing that they were convicted of. And she's not going for what the reader would like to hear, which is that this person is in fact innocent. And she's going to need to be able to ensnare some of the absurdity of the institution. Like they give you a handbook that's 30 pages and then they give you a guide to the handbook that's 140 pages and they want you to read both. And I guess I don't want to close. So why don't you? I just wanted to say that I do think that I see the novel as not necessarily political. That doesn't mean that I'm not political. I spent 2 years writing a very long piece about prison abolition for the New York Times Magazine. So that's like a different set of tools that I use on occasion, but it's not the novel. So I just want.
Can we say?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Yeah. So again, like, thanks everybody. But I do want to echo what's been said. I think the politics that's the stumbling block. And also, I believe in emotional intelligence. And so if you accept the politics, then you accept certain layers of trauma, even if it's secondary or tertiary, because you're not inside. And I think that also can sometimes inhibit whether or not we will walk closer to politics that are not popular. So to shorten, I would say I create two personas. I do the political work. I use the academy to pay for me, my family and health insurance. And then I write theory as an academic. I do the anthologies as a side gig, which is where my heart is. And that's the balance. If you want to call me a writer, I'm definitely an academic, but anything I edit is because there's a relationship. Like all the relationships that you express, we all have them. It's to show up to the relationship, which then becomes a form of politics.
That seems like an excellent note to close on. I feel like there are so many ideas that which we can spend the day unpacking. Thank you so much, Rachel and Caleb and Joy. Thank you.